Hello, family. This is Lisa, everyone. I'm coming to you all with a history part of my channel. First time, everyone. I said before, if any one of you seen my previous videos, that God was giving me some things in the spirit, and at His time, I will bring some things to you about history. So, the other night, I received a vision where it was an indigenous boy, light skinned boy, and he was doing something, and he was doing like he was entertaining people. And this person was like a happy person, and what he was doing was nothing um, satanic in the dream. It was something that would make people happy and laugh. So in my spirit, I was spoken to in the spirit, was said that this is an indigenous person. This was indigenous people, is what was spoken to me. Okay. And with that, I received November the 27th. And I didn't know what was going on and everything. And I do have a little bit of indigenous blood in me. Some things I've been trying to research. And I'm just mixed up with some everybody. So it will be hard to discriminate against me because you will just be discriminating against yourself if you want to discriminate against me because I have Native American, I have Nigerian, I have European, French, German, I have Asian, I have British, Irish, Spanish, Filipino, Indonesian, Northern Asian. I have Southern Eastern African and all kind of things in me. So it would be hard to discriminate against me. You would just be discriminating against yourself, everyone. So everyone, I was confused in my dream or my vision as to why God was giving me November the 27th. And I want you all to see something for a minute. This is what led me to this, okay? I was looking at the Nanticoke people, which is an Indian tribe of indigenous people that settled here in Maryland and Delaware, you all. So this is what came. I came across this article, and I said I had November the 27th. I didn't know what it meant. In the spirit, this was given to me. Something was going to happen for November the 27th. Now, I found, after I woke up from that, I found this is called Pratt Chat. Now, this is from the History of Native Americans blog.prattlibrary.org, everyone. Now, look at this article. The History of Native Americans in Maryland. Look at this article. When was it printed? Can you all see this? November the 27th. November the 27th, 2020. So I say, oh my goodness, Lord, this is what you're telling me. So God is going to do something with this you all. It's something that he's going to bring it to me what it is he's trying to do. And I'm going to give you something about Native Americans of federal Delaware, the federal state Delaware.com. Also, you all about the African Americans and the indigenous Native Americans, everyone, what happened there. But for right now, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to give you this the history of Native Americans in Maryland, okay? November the 27th was posted 2020. That was that November 27th God was giving me. The Friday after Thanksgiving, everyone, is the largely thought of as a day to rest. Friday after Thanksgiving, day to rest, digest and shop. But did you know it is also Native American Heritage Day? This year, as we celebrate and give thanks in slightly different circumstances, let's also take the time to remember the original inhabitants of the lands we now call home. Long before European settlers reached these shores, Maryland was home to dozens of thriving, vibrant societies. Today, their ancestors and cultures live on. They have overcome centuries of hardship, dispossession, genocide, and discrimination, yet still they persist and flourish. Prior to European contact, Maryland was an important crossroads along the Atlantic coast and home to many tribes. Each region of the state was home to distinct nations, which were in turn linked by great trade networks. The names of these nations are still with us, and the and the familiar names we use every day: Antique, Choptank, Piscataway, Nanticoke, Susquehanna, Powhatan. All of these come to us from the native inhabitants of what will become Maryland. Prior to European contact, Maryland was divided among a few major nations by region. Among them were the Shawnee and Ohio Valley tribes in the west, the Susquehanna in northern central Maryland, the Lenape in northeastern Maryland, the Powhatans around what is now Washington, D.C., and the Choptank and Nanticoke on the eastern shore. During the colonial and early American period, the native inhabitants of Maryland were systematically removed from their lands and relocated westward, often to Oklahoma. Okay, the first group to gain recognition from the Maryland government was the Nanticoke tribe in 1881. Everybody, I believe I might be descendant of them. Other tribes, nations, and confederacies followed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, three tribes are formally recognized by the state of Maryland. Okay, the Ancohanac tribe, the Piscataway Conoy tribe, and the Piscataway Nation. The Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs serves eight distinct Native groups: the Ancohanac Indian Tribe, the Assateagues People Tribe, the Cedarville Band of Piscataway Indians, subgroup of the Piscataway Conoy Tribe, the Nase Wabash Band of Indians, the Piscataway Conoy Confederacy, and subtribes, subgroup of the Piscataway Conoy Tribe, the Piscataway Indian Nation, the Pocomoke Indian Nation, and the Guinea River Band of Shawnee Indians. In the second half of the 20th century, the population of Native Americans in Maryland began to go as many southern tribes migrated to the north along with our minorities. Part of this migration included many members of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. The Lumbee settled in East Baltimore and in 1968 established the Baltimore American Indian Center, and were the driving force behind the campaign to rename Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in Maryland. Today, Baltimore is home to the largest number of Lumbee outside of their traditional tribal lands. As of the last census, more than 40,000 people in Maryland identify as Native Americans. Okay, to learn more about the Native peoples of Maryland, check out these titles from the Pratt Library: Indians of Southern Maryland. Okay, everybody, this is what this is. If you want to know more about that. Now I'm going to read to you something off of Native Americans of Federal Delaware State.com, everyone. All right, now, as a societal dynamic, African slavery impacted every aspect of the American social fabric. Native Americans, too, were not exempt from experiencing the flaws of that fabric. Slaves and slave masters and Indians also played a significant role in the earliest Underground Railroad. Earliest Underground Railroad. Okay, everyone. Indians, especially those living near swamps, often to their detriment, harbored runaway black slaves. All right. Indians harbored runaway black slaves. Is what they did, everyone. All right. That's the second, everyone. Let's find out where I'm at. It say that the Indians harbored runaway black slaves. All right. One such tribe, the Delmarva's Nanticokes, originally living along the Nanticoke River in Dorchester, Maryland County, provided refuge to runaways. The principal hiding place for runaways was the swamp. Certain locals became renowned for what was known as maroon communities. Dense vegetation and marshy terrain made the swamps a difficult place for masters and bounty hunters to search for the runaways. Okay. Hunters to search for the runaways. David Hunter Strother, an artist for Harper's Magazine in 1856, captured the fear and determination of the runaway Osman in the dismal swamp of North Carolina and Virginia. Also in 1856, Harriet Beecher Stowe, famous for her Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote in dread tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. A lot of us heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin in school. Away to the dismal swamp he speeds. His path was rugged and sore through tangled juniper, beds of seeds, through many a fen where the serpent feeds, a man never trod before. Encountering a fugitive in the swamp, dread, modeled after Nat Turner of the 1831 Southampton, Virginia slave rebellion, harbors him. The Virginia Slave Code of the 1700s attests to the frequency of such escapes. Whereas many times slaves run away and lie out, hid and lurking in the swamps, woods, and other obscure places, killing cattle and hogs and committing other injuries to the inhabitants of the state. Anyone who harbored a fugitive took a great risk. So, if like the Native Americans that harbored them, anyone who wanted to harbor them, they took a risk. You could get killed harboring the slaves back then. Okay. So you took a great risk to be fined and things like that. At the very least, the law provided that anyone who did so will pay the owner of the slaves 10 shillings for each 24 hours, 1795. Runaway slaves who hid in swamps plundered plantations outside Washington, North Carolina. Washington, North Carolina, okay. George Alfred Townsend's entailed hat describes similar circumstances of Virgie's flight and Delaware's Great Cypress Swamp, counterpart of the Dismal Swamp in Virginia. The cedar swamps of Delaware were noted refuge runaways. 18th century Pennsylvania newspapers were filled with advertisements specifically mentioning the cedar swamps of Delaware as a runaway destination. It's in these areas that current mixed race communities now exist. Okay. Runaways found support and refuge in Native American communities, such as the Nanticokes. The Tidewater people lived in small villages along the streams and rivers, including the Pocomoke River that flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. The region's swamplands became significant sites on the Underground Railroad for escaping slaves. By the early 18th century, mixed-blooded communities had formed in Kent and Sussex counties near Cheswold and Indian River, respectively. Members of the Indian descendant Puckman, Norwood, Ridgway, and Cambridge families from Eastern Shore, Maryland, and Sussex intermarried with the Kent County community in the early 19th century. The census term mulatto became a catch-all for any non-white person. According to Shaw's History 1888, surrounding communities recognized the Moors, a triracial isolate, as a distinct ethnic group. In 1895, Judge George Purnell Fisher wrote an article for the Smyrna Times titled "The So-Called Moors of Delaware." 40 years before, Fisher had prosecuted Levin Sockham and his son-in-law Harmon in a famous Delaware case concerning the question of racial identity. Based upon Nanticoke Lydia Clark's testimony, the defendants were found to be of a triracial origin and thus guilty of selling gunpowder to a Negro or mulatto. Both Harmon and Salcombe denied any Negro ancestry. Okay? The story of the Moors and Nanticokes presents a different perspective on the issue of racial identity. Writing in 1943, Westlager stated, "The cabins occupied by the remaining Indians, the Nanticokes, concealed in he woods some distance from towns, were excellent hideouts for runaway slaves." Okay, were some excellent hideouts for runaway slaves, it says. In the Maryland records of 1722, there is a reference to several of your own Negroes and slaves having already run away to the said Indians and leaving now among them. This was not only true of Negro slaves, mulattoes, and indentured white servants. Upon breaking their shackles, took the woods and found food, land, shelter in the scattered native huts. Hospitality was and is rated high among the Eastern Shore Indians. Okay, on the question of mulattoes, Westlager concluded the Delaware Gazette advertisements gave insight into their existence. For instance, in the April 22, 1796 issue, page 3, an advertisement tellingly spoke of Eastern Shore runaways. James Lynch's advertisement read, "Reward for runaways." Just a second, everyone. Thank you all for waiting. On the question of mulattoes, Westlager concluded the Delaware Gazette advertisements gave insight into their existence. For instance, in the April 22, 1796 issue, page 3, an advertisement tellingly spoke of Eastern Shore runaways. Okay, you all, I had to read this over to you again because that's where I left off. This was the advertisement, you all, for a runaway slave. A Negro woman with a child. She is a low, thick woman, very black. Her child is a bright mulatto. As enlightening as the runaway advertisements are, Indian treaties provide conclusive evidence of the complexity of African and Native Americans' interaction. 17th and 18th century Indian treaties reflect a slave-holding colonial society struggling with the institution of slavery. Treaty clauses for Delmarva addressed the fugitive slave problem. Between 1663 and 1666, Maryland commissioners negotiated with the Indians of Piscataway, Ananaskanack, the Mulatto women, the Chingwatiak, Port Tabox, and Pangayai. These are some difficult words to pronounce, you all. The 12th article of the 1666 treaty stated, in case any servants or slaves run away from their masters and come to any of the Indian towns aforesaid, that the said Indians shall apprehend them and bring them to the next English plantation to be conveyed to their masters. And if any Indians assist or convey any such fugitive out of the province, that he shall make the respective master or masters of such servant or slave such satisfaction as an Englishman ought to do in the like case. Okay, this is quoted in Scharf P. page 291. Now, in 1678, Maryland's Philip Calvert made a treaty of peace and amity with the Vano Casimon, Emperor of the Nanticokes. Article 6 essentially reiterated the earlier treaty in case any servant or slave run away from their master and come to any of Indian towns within the territories of Venocasimon and his subjects, they be bound to apprehend the said fugitives and bring them to the next English plantation to be conveyed to their masters' proceedings. Okay. The autumn of 1722 saw major treaties. On September 11, 1722, the governor of Virginia made certain propositions to the five native nations of Indians. The governor maintained, "You sent me last year a belt of wampum as a testimony of your promise that you will seize and carry to Virginia some runaway Negroes." Okay, everybody. Now I make a general proposition that if any such Negro or slave shall hereafter fall into your hands, you shall straightway conduct them to George Mason's house on the Potomac River, and you shall there receive immediately upon the delivery of every such runaway one good gun and two blankets. All right. Brother Acerrigos responded, "As to the proposition you made relating to Negroes, we promise that if any runaway Negroes or slaves shall happen to fall into our hands, we will carry them to George Mason's on the Potomac River for your reward you proposed." Then in October and November 1722, the province of Maryland drafted its major treatise on the question of Indians and the runaway slave. On October 22nd, 1722, the treatise was read in the upper house of assembly. It stated, "Another proposition I have to make to you Indians, with respect to runaway Negroes and slaves, it being a matter of importance which must greatly affect the properties of people in these parts. If Indians be allowed to harbor our slaves as the Shawnees at this time do, and protect them under the pretense of their having set such slaves free, this gentleman we look upon as a matter of great importance to this province, several of our own Negroes and slaves having already run away to the Indians and living among them, which if not in time prevented, may be an encouragement to greater numbers of them to do so." On November 1st, 1722, the above message was read again on the floor of the General Assembly and was passed and proposed. After the passage of the legislation, census takers in the late 18th century visited Indian communities east of Mississippi River, identifying, categorizing, and counting. When the census takers discovered Native American communities harboring runaways, the tribes were threatened with the loss of their tribal status, the nullification of treaties, land claims, and trade agreements. Despite these sanctions, Native Americans and Africans remained allied. In addition to Delmarva's refuge safe havens, other recognized runaway camps include the Shawnee Old Field Village on the Potomac River, an area 20 miles north of the mouth of Savannah River, a vicinity between New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi River, next to Combahee and Ashtabula rivers in the South Carolina, Tuscarora, North Carolina, as an encampment near the Pamunkey River in Virginia. Colonial laws and state statutes concerning the harboring of fugitive slaves reflect society's values and attitudes toward what is deemed to be property. The laws listed here are representative of the various jurisdictions. Okay, everyone. All right. 1640. New Netherlands laws forbids residents from harboring or feeding runaway slaves. 1640. Punitive fugitive laws applying to both indentured service and slaves were enacted in Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey, South Carolina, and Virginia. 1751. South Carolina law stated the carrying of Negroes among the Indians has all along been thought detrimental, as an intimacy ought to be avoided. 1848, Georgia Slave Code makes it a punishable offense for free Negro, mulatto, and mestizo to harbor slaves. Constables were authorized to search suspected premises for runaway slaves. 1856, Mississippi law mandated that any Indian, free, black, or mulatto found guilty of harboring a runaway was to be fined $50 for each black so harbored and imprisoned in the penitentiary for up to 1 year. The 1856 law had amended a 1839 law stipulating that an Indian found guilty of harboring any enslaved black would pay the owner $50 and all court costs and be imprisoned between 3 and 6 months. 1642. A Virginian law penalized persons sheltering runaways £20 worth of tobacco for each night of refuge granted. Slaves were branded with an R on the face after a second escape. Henning statutes. Be it further also enacted that if any servant run away, as aforesaid, shall carry either piece, powder, and shot, and leave either all or any of them with the Indians, and being thereof lawfully convicted, shall suffer death as in case of felony. One of the most compelling arguments that Indians harbor fugitive slaves is the excellence of multiracial peoples. African and Native Americans intertwine among complex paths, influencing the emergence of a blended culture. Miscegenation was a powerful social behavior imbued with inherent racism. In April 1691, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed the first anti-miscegenation law, an act for suppressing outlying slaves. Upon arriving in Kansas in 1850, Quaker missionary Wilson Hobbs noticed the number of mixed bloods in the Shawnee tribe. A century earlier, M. Viner, a Jesuit missionary to the Louisiana Territory, noted, "We have here whites, Negroes, and Indians, to say nothing of the crossbreeds." A concrete example demonstrating the existence of multiracial people involves Sally Johnson's, a Cherokee woman residing in Alabama, application to sell a reservation of land in 1831. The reservation of land, 640 acres, was made to her husband, Peter Johnson. Peter was adjudged to be a runaway slave. The House's Committee on Public Lands. She asked Congress to confirm the reservation to her and her children, and that she be permitted to sell the simple estate. American State Papers, House of Representatives, 21st Congress, Second Session, Public Lands, Volume 6, page 266, number 892. Another specific example of racial mixing can be seen in a 1778 New Jersey advertisement for a runaway. The advertisement read, "Was stolen from her mother, a Negro girl about 9 or 10 years of age named Diana. Her mother's name is Cash, was married to the Indian named Lewis Wallace. Any person who takes up the said Negroes and Indians shall have the above reward." Triracial isolates describe communities resulting from the mixing of white, black, and red people. Some of the first black, white, Indian, and mixed families intermarried or interbred in the 1600s in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Carolinas. The offspring became known as the Melungeons. At first, interracial marriage was legal in Virginia. North American Indians ancestors of Melungeons came from the Powhatan, Mattapony, Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Catawba, Cherokee, and Choctaw communities. The African ancestors of the Melungeons came from northeast Angola and southern Congo. The original ancestors of the Melungeons were free African Americans who married whites in Virginia and other colonies. The Moors of the Delaware can be traced to this lineage through the linking of identical surnames. Documented accounts are extremely rare due to the secret nature of Underground Railroads activities and underwritten language. Those few extant records are as valuable as they are poignant. Juniper's own notice In 1814, his slave ran from Kentucky into Tennessee. The master concluded it is supposed he had lived with Creek Indians and will endeavor to get the nation again. Okay, this is so powerful, everyone. An invaluable source chronicling personal histories of Indians, especially those removed to Oklahoma, is Black Indian Slave Narratives, edited by Patrick Menzies, 2004, interviewed by the WPA in 1937. John Harrison recalled, Mother has told me that before the war, Civil War, the people as a whole were living very comfortably and satisfied. The Indians, Creeks, had intermarried with the white and colored, and they became citizens of the tribe, and that they too were satisfied with the full blood in this new land of theirs. This is in Menzies, pages 86. Nellie Johnson was less positive in her recollection of racial mixtures. Nellie stated, some of the Negro girls that I know are mixed up with the poor Creeks and Seminoles, and some got married to them after the war, but none of my family ever did mix up with them, that I know, she said. Cheney Mack of Mississippi related, yes, my father was a full-blooded African from near Liberia. Mack's story told how his father was put on the block and sold in Dalton, Georgia. One found memory involves Mack's father making a fiddle out of a pine bark and playing for the family to dance. That's in Menzies, page 152. Of his mother, Mack stated, my mother was a pure-blood Indian, a Choctaw. She was born near Lookout Mountain up in Tennessee on a river in a log hut. Of his parents' marriage, Mack described both the African custom of jumping over to the broom and the Indian's tradition. The chief would stand before the holding couple and repeat, he is black and she is yellow, made out of beeswax. Okay, and there's some more things they will say. I'm not going to repeat that. Ned Thompson, interviewed by the WPA in Oklahoma in 1937, gives a detailed account of his family's history. His grandfather was an Alabama slave known as Cow Tom, whose family was removed to the Western Indian Territory in 1832. And interpreter Cow Tom fought in the Florida War in 1868. Cow Tom went to Washington, D.C. to plead the case of Creeks' entitlements to land and money. Geraldine Elliott Robinson, great-great-granddaughter of Cow Tom, documented the Cow Tom account to her genealogical research posted on the web. Robinson chronicled her family living among the Seminoles and resisting the federal plan of Indian removal. A relative, Ben Bruno, a Maroon in Florida, served as Billy Bowleg's interpreter. After bad treaties and camp burnings, members of her families gathered at Juniper. Florida began heading to Tampa Bay. The next stop was New Orleans, but before arriving there, men swamped the slave ships, saying, these are our runaway slaves harbored by the Seminoles. We want them and their descendants. These are our legitimate slaves. Here are our papers. Family members were taken to Fort Pike and held for 13 months. Eventually released, they journeyed to Fort Gibson, Indian Territory, arriving May 1838. The history of Native Americans harboring fugitive slaves has been an elusive study. Scholars have been challenged by irretrievable accounts and sparse documentation. Yet the story of the Seminoles of Florida does provide insight into the activities of Nanticokes of Delmarva, while many Indian tribes imitated the white man in owning chattel slaves. The Seminoles never did. From the beginning of slavery, slaves attempted to escape in the 17th century. Many Africans from the Carolinas, Alabama, and Georgia escaped to Florida and built settlements near the Seminoles. The two peoples bonded and formed a close union based on their mutual hatred of slavery. Despite the U.S. government's attempts to break up their union, the two peoples, through intermarriages and friendship, remained allied. The Africans became known as Black Seminoles. The term Seminole is Spanish for Cimarron, meaning runaway. This Indian of the Creek tribe had escaped from slavery and land encroachment in the British colonies. The first Seminoles found refuge in Florida along the Suwannee and Apalachicola rivers. Because the territory was governed by Spain under Spanish policy, slaves in Florida were never chattel. For the slaveholding states in the Deep South, Indian protected South Carolina assigned slave patrols to watch roads and countryside. In 1728, South Carolina acting governor Arthur Middleton wrote, "The Spanish are receiving and harboring all of our runaway Negroes. They found out a new way of sending out slaves against us to rob and plunder us. They are continually fitting out parties of Indians from St. Augustine to murder our white people, to rob our plantations and carry out our slaves." Middleton, a rice planter who held 107 slaves at the time of his death in 1737, had been personally affected by the Spanish policy of encouraging runaways. For the Spanish, the encouragement was just one more ploy to be used against their British enemies. In 1773, Indian agent David Tate threatened to cut off Creek trade unless the Indians returned the fugitives. Okay. South Carolina authorities also require all traders to report and apprehend any Negroes found among the Indians. In 1823, Florida's Legislative Council warned Territorial Governor William P. Duval of the existing evils. The 14-page memorial spoke to those evils. Great numbers of Negroes belonging to the planters availing themselves of existing disorders and runaways, only to take refuge among the Indians. Spain also had no interest in returning African and Native American refugees to the British. In fact, the Spanish policy was designed to pit the fugitives and natives against the British. During the early 1700s, other tribes, including the Utes, Yamasees, and Choctaws, joined the Seminoles in their journey from Georgia to northern Florida. White men called them along with the Chickasaws and Cherokees. The five civilized tribes, however, the freedom these tribes so desperately sought escaped them. Parties of slave catchers crossed the borders from Georgia and Alabama. Okay. Including, okay, Georgia and Alabama. To northern Florida, the white man called them, everyone civilized, Georgia and Alabama, to rove Spanish North Florida, and all runaways that tribal hunting grounds and settlements were being snatched up from under them by the land-hungry Europeans. Conflict ensued, and the Spanish government was unable to maintain social order. The explosive situation escalated after 1814 when the Red Stick losers of the Creek Civil War emigrated to Florida and joined the runaway blacks and Seminoles. Several hundred runaway slaves had established Angola, a settlement stretching from Tampa to Sarasota County. At the close of the War of 1812, a British Major Edward Nichols led an expedition recruiting Seminoles and black runaway slaves to fight the Americans. On Prospect Bluff of the Apalachicola River, the British and her allies constructed the fort. When the British withdrew from the area, her allies moved into the fort, now known as Negro Fort. This bastion served as a rallying point for the runaways. In 1816, the American Army under General Andrew Jackson ordered the construction of Fort Scott on the Flint River to protect the Florida border and to destroy Negro Fort. A perceived threat to Georgia's slaveocracy. That summer, Jackson ordered Negro forced destruction and the return of the 31 surviving blacks to their white owners. During the next 2 years, Jackson and his men burned Seminole villages and captured Spanish towns of St. Mark's and Pensacola. The Americans drove the Seminoles into the Oakland Cay swamplands. Under the terms of the Transcontinental Treaty, Spain ceded the Florida Territory to the United States in 1819. Though Andrew Jackson's brutal tactics spawned a congressional investigation, the 15th Congress was sympathetic to national expansionism. Later dubbed Manifest Destiny, moreover, many other representatives and senators were slaveholders. While the First Seminole War granted Florida to the new nation, it did not stop runaway slaves from fleeing to Florida. The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, resulted from the policy to remove the Seminoles from Florida. The runaway slaves, fearful of being turned over to the white masters, helped to persuade their allies, the Seminoles, to resist removal as settlers increased. The Seminoles grew increasingly frustrated with their dwindling lands. Under the Treaty of the Moultrie Creek of 1823, the Seminoles had agreed to exchange their existing land claims for that of 4 million acres, reservation south of Osceola. However, the reservation proved agriculturally unsatisfactory, and the whites continued to see, believing the Seminoles were harboring runaway slaves. The October 16, 1824 edition of the St. Augustine, East Florida Herald indicted Negroes are harbored among the Indians with impunity. During the 1820s, the Florida Legislative Council imposed strong sanctions against assisting runaways, including outlawing miscegenation. I had been receiving the British, you all, and I was researching things about the British and the Civil War and things, that they had taught us in school. But some of these things I've never known before. God is opening me up to some things, and He must want these things to be known for some reason. Something God must be doing. All things are possible to God because this country was made on the backs, was built on the backs of slaves, and people still want to go back to those days. But God is a God who shall not lie, and God is going to do some things, and I don't know how He's using me with this, but this is something that God is bringing me to the forefront that He want to be known, everybody. So I have to be obedient because I did not know what God was going at with me with November the 27th, and I did not have no idea where He was going with me with the indigenous boy in the dream. I didn't know what all this was, but He's bringing things out to the forefront. There has to be a reckoning for things, and God is judge over this world, everyone. So I want to say that um, don't ever be afraid of who you are. Okay, I'm mixed up with so many things inside of me. I'm mixed up with so many things that are inside of me, and I'm not ashamed of nothing. I'm not ashamed of the European blood. I'm not ashamed of the East Asian blood. I'm not ashamed of the indigenous blood. I'm not ashamed of the West African, Nigerian blood, the Congolian blood, the Southeast Asian blood. I'm not ashamed of anything. I embrace who I am wholeheartedly. I like wearing big earrings. I like having my hair and a little fro. I like burlap and things of that nature, things that you see behind me. So each and every ethnicity I can see my qualities and my traits within me, you know. So you all don't ever be afraid of who you are. Don't ever be afraid of what you look like. Don't ever be afraid of if you're light or if you're dark. Embrace who you are in Christ. You know, God is going to bring things for the forefront. You know, he judges us, you all. So I pray, always pray for people that have this racism attitude, and this is not who God wished for us to be. Okay, He created us to be Christ-like. Everyone, I just thank you all for listening, and hopefully you all have learned something, because some of these things I've never known before. And people were all mixed up. We all interbreeded with one another, you know. And but we all need to be children of God. Okay, so don't never be ashamed of what you look like or who you are. All right, because the Lord God love us all. Okay, and just be blessed in Christ, and just pray for one another. Pray for yourselves and pray for each other. You all. So be blessed, you all. Come back again with God, with whatever God gives me, lead me, to give you all. So be blessed, you all, in the spirit of the Lord. Bye bye, you all. This is Lisa.